Hello and welcome to Mystical Tutor. These are a series of 5 to 15-minute classes designed to help improve your knowledge of the rules and policies of the Magic the Gathering Judge program. This lesson will be on mana abilities. We will go over what the definition of a mana ability is, how mana abilities can be activated, how mana abilities resolve, and some special cases with some specific types of mana abilities. So, I'm sure you've heard the term mana ability before. There are even some cards that specifically reference mana abilities. But what exactly is a mana ability? Well, it's just about how it sounds. A mana ability is an activated ability that puts mana into a player's mana pool. Any triggered ability that produces mana and triggers from an activated mana ability is also a mana ability. So now that we know what a mana ability is, what about what a mana ability isn't? There are some exceptions to this definition of a mana ability, and they are as follows. The first exception for mana abilities is that mana abilities cannot have targets. That means if the word target is anywhere in the ability's text, it will not be a mana ability. Take Deathrite Shaman's first ability, for example. It reads, exile target land card from a graveyard. Add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. Even though the targeting part seems separate from the mana part of the ability, it's still all one ability. And since this ability targets, it is not a mana ability. Some abilities ask you to choose something, like Spectral Searchlight. Spectral Searchlight says, choose a player. That player adds 1 mana of any color he or she chooses to his or her mana pool. Choosing something is not targeting, so this ability does not target, and therefore is a mana ability. The second exception for mana abilities is that mana abilities cannot be Planeswalker loyalty abilities. As of this lesson, the only cards that this applies to are Xenagos the Reveler, Koth of the Hammer, and Sarkhan Unbroken. This exception really exists to prevent players from activating Planeswalker loyalty abilities at times they shouldn't normally be able to. Okay, so those are the exception for mana abilities, but there are also some things that may look like mana abilities, but are not mana abilities at all. The most common offenders for this category are something like Frontier Siege on Khans. While this is a triggered ability that adds mana, the source of the trigger is not a mana ability, making Frontier Siege's Khans ability not a mana ability. An example of when a triggered ability is a mana ability would be something like Heartbeat of Spring. Heartbeat of Spring triggers whenever a land taps for mana. So as long as each land's ability is a mana ability, so will the triggered ability from Heartbeat of Spring. There are also a lot of spells that generate mana. Mana abilities are specifically activated abilities and some triggered abilities, not spells. There are some older cards like Dark Ritual that had the type mana source printed on them, but have since received errata to become instant spells. Instant or sorcery spells cannot be mana abilities. They are just treated as normal spells on the stack and can be responded to just like any other spell. Similarly, Convoke and Delve are abilities that allow you to pay mana by doing something other than activating mana abilities. These abilities actually only affect the game during the pay cost step, not the activating mana ability step of casting a spell. There are also static abilities, not activated or triggered abilities, so that also means they cannot be mana abilities. Some mana abilities have additional effects. Take Elves of Deep Shadow for instance. Its mana ability reads, add black to your mana pool. Elves of Deep Shadow deals 1 damage to you. Well, this ability is an activated ability that produces mana and doesn't target, so it's definitely a mana ability. There are also some that make players draw cards, like Chromatic Sphere, or cause cards to move zones, like Deranged Assistant. All of these mana abilities are treated just the same as other mana abilities. They resolve in the same way and can be activated at the same times. So now we know what mana abilities are and are not. What happens when you activate mana abilities? Well, you activate them just the same as any other ability, except they do not use the stack. This means a few things, first of which is they cannot be responded to. This also means that the player who activated the ability retains priority. Sometimes a mana ability will trigger another ability that does not produce mana, like Vorinclex Voice of Hunger's second ability. When these abilities trigger, they go onto the stack the same time any other triggers would, the next time a player would receive priority. How about an example? Arthur controls Vorinclex Voice of Hunger, and Noreen controls Deathrite Shaman. Arthur casts Gulf Squid, which resolves and he puts its trigger on the stack targeting Noreen. In response to the trigger, Noreen taps her 3 lands, triggering Vorinclex's ability 3 times. Noreen still has priority, and she wants to activate Deathrite Shaman's first ability targeting a land in her graveyard. Since Noreen would receive priority to do so, Vorinclex's triggered abilities are put onto the stack, and then she activates Deathrite Shaman's ability in response to those. While we're talking about activating mana abilities, let's go over when players can activate mana abilities. The first time is the most obvious, whenever a player has priority. As was said before, since mana abilities don't use the stack, the player who had priority when activating the mana ability will retain it even after it resolves. Another time when players can activate mana abilities is during the casting of a spell. There is a specific step in casting a spell just before paying costs where the player casting the spell can activate mana abilities. We will go over this in more detail during the lesson on casting a spell. Players may also activate mana abilities during the Declare Attackers and Declare Blockers steps in the combat phase. If you remember the lesson on the combat phase, you'll know that some creatures like Kalsizma Behemoth require a player to pay a cost as they're being declared as an attacker or a blocker. There are also some specific cards like Ghostly Prison that make a player pay costs if they are attacking a specific player. All of these costs are paid in the Declare Attackers and Declare Blockers steps before players receive priority. Similarly to casting a spell, there's an opportunity for attacking or blocking player to activate mana abilities just before you pay the costs. Okay. So now we know when you can activate mana abilities and how they resolve, but there's some strange cases with mana abilities. Like when a mana ability would produce no mana, for example. Let's say you have a Nykthos Shrine to Nyx, but you have no devotion to white. When you activate Nykthos' ability for white, even though it produces no mana, it is still a mana ability. However, this will not trigger effects that look for tapping a land for mana like Verdant Haven. Basically, a mana ability remains a mana ability even if the game state would not allow it to produce mana, but the game still cares about what it actually produced. Producing 0 mana is different from not being able to produce mana though. There are some cards that produce mana based on choices made or some other conditions. Let's take Meteor Crater for example. If you control Meteor Crater and no other permanents, then Meteor Crater cannot produce mana because you cannot choose a color of a permanent you control since Meteor Crater is colorless. Basically, if a mana ability would produce 1 or more mana of an undefined type, it will produce no mana instead. Some mana abilities produce mana based on what other permanents could produce, like Exotic Orchard. The mana this ability could produce is based on the mana it would generate if the ability were to resolve with the current game state. For example, if each player controls only Exotic Orchard, neither can produce mana. However, if a player controls Forest and an Orchard, and the other player controls just an Orchard, both orchards can produce green. These types of effects don't take into account the cost of abilities, however. If a player controls a Vivid Meadow with no charge counters and a Reflecting Pool, the Reflecting Pool could still produce a mana of any color because Reflecting Pool's ability doesn't care about how many charge counters it has, just about what types of mana Vivid Meadow can produce. Okay, remember the mana abilities that cause cards to move zones? Chromatic Sphere, Deranged Hermit, and Selvala Explorer Returned are all examples of these types of abilities. Well, there are some special rules for these. If a mana ability causes a card to move zones while players do not have priority, like casting a spell or during declare attackers or declare blockers steps, that card enters the new zone face down and nobody is allowed to look at it until a player receives priority. While it is face down, the characteristics of the card are not known. This means when you pay cost for casting a spell, if you activated Chromatic Sphere during the casting of the spell, you may discard this unknown card for something like Tormenting Voice, but you may not exile it to pay for Force of Will's alternate cost, because you have no way of knowing if it's blue or not. So, that's all you need to know about mana abilities. Always remember that a mana ability is an activated ability that produces mana, does not target, and is not a Planeswalker loyalty ability. This completes the lesson on mana abilities. Be sure to check back for more lessons at www.mysticaltutor.org.